is Australia.
This fucking language.
Let there be 1,000 blossoms bloom as far as I'm concerned. You know, but I ain't spending any time on it.
Give him a Valium. Don't stop wearing the Speedos.
You're listening to Decode, the Betoota Advocate's podcast series for those Australians who have tuned out or never tuned in to the dark arts of federal politics.
It's called being, you wouldn't believe it, a goddamn bloody adult.
Well, we're on the home stretch of the federal election now, with 2 more weeks to go until the Australian people head to the ballot to decide their future. If you've been following the Betoota Advocate's coverage of this election with the Decode podcast, thank you for tuning in again. If you're new to the Decode podcast, you've chosen a hell of a first episode. So far throughout this series, we've spoken to a lot of politicians and political players about a range of different topics. We've done candidate profiles. We've discussed the dark arts of polling and preferences, as well as the role the unions play, the history of both the Liberal and Labor Party. And following the trend of this current election campaign, we've also spoken to a lot of independents. Now, with 2 weeks to go, we've decided to steer this ship back to the major parties because at the end of the day, regardless of how many crossbenchers make it into Parliament, the next government will be led by either a Liberal MP or a Labor MP. My name's Clancy Overall, editor of the Betoota Advocate, and I'm joined as always by Errol Parker. How you going, Errol?
It's a good morning here in the Diamantina. Clear. It's starting to get a bit chilly, but I tell you what, it's going to get much colder in Canberra in these last 2.5 weeks.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of election fatigue going around, so we thought we'd tighten it up and start talking about, you know, what both major parties are running with on this final dash to the finish line. Today we're talking to a shadow cabinet minister for Anthony Albanese's Labor Party. It didn't take us long to lock this one in because the ALP are trying to get their message out there whichever way they can. For any Liberal staffers that might be listening, we'd love to hear from you about lining up a Liberal frontbencher for next week because we've spoken to Dave Sharma, we've spoken to Jason Falinski's people, we've spoken to Tim Wilson. Even Josh Frydenberg's people won't get back to us. They don't want to bar us. So if you're listening, get back to us. We want you for this last episode. Today, for the second last episode, our guest is the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, a high-profile attack dog for the Labor Party, and the member for McMahon, deep out in the area, Western Sydney. Thank you for joining us, Chris Bowen.
Pleasure, Clancy. G'day, Errol. Good to be out of the big smoke and in the Diamantina in Betoota. It's always good to be back.
Well, I'm sure David Littlepower rolled out the red carpet for you this morning at the airport.
He sent me a text message welcoming me to his patch, yeah. No, he's good like that, to be fair.
Now, we want to talk to you about your story. We've seen you in a range of different cabinet kind of portfolios and shadow portfolio roles. As I said before, you're kind of a high-profile face within the Labor Party. And as everyone seems to, you know, be tightening up, the Labor Party is looking like a different thing this time around. It's looking like a well-oiled machine. What drew you to this machine? That's what we want to first kind of start with. I mean, aside from being a Western Sydney lad in an area that's always voted Labor, what drew you into the Labor Party?
Yeah, so I grew up in Western Sydney on the, you know, as they say, the wrong side of the tracks. My dad was a shift worker. He used to go off to work at 11 o'clock at night and come home at 7 in the morning. My mum was a childcare worker who looked after kids in her own home, so she used to have to try and look after kids while Dad was asleep in the front room. So, you know, it was all going on. We lived in a, you know, 5-borough house in Smithfield. You know, I was attracted to politics because I looked around me and thought there's stuff that's just not right. You know, obviously I was very unformed. It wasn't a very sophisticated view, but I looked around and I saw people working their guts out, not really getting ahead. I saw people I went to school with who were clearly very bright, and going to uni was never even a prospect. It wasn't anything we would talk about. And I just had a feeling that there was a better way. And then I worked out pretty early, to my way of thinking, that politics was a way to get your hands on the big levers to try and change things and make things fairer. And then I worked out pretty early that the Labor Party was the only party that cared about people like us, in my view, you know, and tried to make things a bit fairer and give people a fair shot at getting ahead. And so I took myself off as a 15-year-old to the local Labor Party branch meeting in my school uniform, and I got a few looks as I walked in because they thought, you know, who stacked him in? But I was actually just turning up to see what it was all about, and basically fell in love with the party from my first meeting. And, you know, the things that the Labor Party was talking about, this was at the time when Hawke was Prime Minister and Keating was Treasurer, and, you know, Keating was the member for the seat next door to ours, so he was a Western Sydney boy. So it was all very exciting. So that's what drew me in, yeah.
Well, I suppose, a person like Paul Keating would have basically, forged a bit of a path, really. I mean, like, he didn't have a top-flight education. He didn't go to some fancy sandstone university, and he ended up being the treasurer.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he sort of deployed the English language in the cause of reform. He wanted to change things. And that's what I was about, in a very unformed, kiddie sort of a way. But I was interested in change. How are we going to... I didn't like the society, I didn't like community the way it was working. I knew that there was something wrong. I knew that our school was underfunded. I knew that just because it was a Western Sydney public school, we were missing out. I knew that, again, as I said, there were heaps of kids I went to school with. I just knew they were smarter than me and they should be going to uni, but they weren't even thinking about it. I was thinking about uni, but it just wasn't something that you did, by and large, And, the hospital was, when I was growing up, our Fairfield Hospital was built in World War II. It was effectively fibro, full of asbestos. It was just, nobody gave a shit about us, basically. So I knew that, again, I thought in my own sort of immature way, well, I could go and work for not-for-profits and charities, but that's dealing with the symptoms. Politics is how you deal with the causes, and you do what Paul Keating says, get your hands on the levers. The levers change things, and that's what drew me to Labor politics.
We've interviewed a lot of footballers on the Betoota Advocate podcast, a lot of rugby league players who say similar things to what you're saying. For every bloke that makes it out of Western Sydney into the NRL, or out of a country town in the NRL, there was a kid back home that just didn't follow that trajectory for whatever reason. Quite often social issues, quite often, their own drive. What was it that got you through university? Did you come from a household that kind of had that, were looking at that for you? Or
No.
was it your involvement in politics? Were you one of those Labor kids that got a tap on the shoulder and said, mate, go get an education, we'll use you later?
I don't know, Clancy. I just don't know. It was just in me. No, my parents obviously were wonderful parents. They loved me very much and, gave me every support they could, but they'd never been to uni. It was never a thing for them. They worked hard to, ensure that I had that option to support me, but no, it didn't come from them. They would have been equally, supportive if I'd left school at year 10 and gone off to TAFE. That wasn't a big thing for them. So I don't know where it came from. Again, I think it was just this feeling that, things have got to change, and I worked out that for me, a uni education was something I needed to get ahead and to, make the mark I wanted to make on society. And nobody really pulled me aside in the Labor Party and said, go get an education. But they did encourage me. I look back and there were sort of 3 or 4 people I can name, some of whom aren't with us anymore, who said, you got something going on, kid, stick with it and work hard and you'll be okay and follow your dreams. So, yeah, to a degree, I think, but it wasn't specific. It wasn't you go to uni and, in 20 years' time we'll put you in Parliament. It was nothing like that. Life doesn't work like that, certainly in the Labor Party. But it was, kid, you got something there, just work on it and we'll see what happens.
This is in both major parties and it's in the Greens as well. A lot of youth politics kind of plays a big part in creating distrust in the major parties because you end up seeing these chosen ones. The Labor Party in Central Queensland, who, I'm sure you guys haven't written off just yet. They've been voting for the Nats for quite a while now. But, a big part of them swinging would have been the fact that they saw all of these little, born to rule kids from both major parties. The National Party kind of doesn't emulate that, and they work hard to make sure they don't look like those.
Well, yeah, they work hard the perception, I think.
Yeah.
How did you avoid that yourself? You don't strike us as that. You don't strike us as someone who came through all that, pointless kind of youth politics, complaining about university membership fees and that kind of stuff, or car parks and shit at uni where people are just kind of getting worked up and they like this cosplay of being a politician at 19 years old, which is actually not a very nice thing to kind of look at as a coal miner.
Well, you're on to me because, well, I never did student politics. Yeah. I never really did Young Labor. I was a member and I helped out my mates, but it was never really my thing. I was never on the executive or anything like that. And to the degree that I ever did student politics, I did join the Labor Club, but I was at uni when Hex was coming in, when Hawke and Keating were introducing Hex.
So it was you and hockey up there.
Well, except I turned up at the Labor Club meeting and said, I think this is a great idea. I think we should pay. I think we should finance those who come after us. And I was in a minority of, 2 or something. But I was like, no, we should be paying. And when we're earning money, we should be putting something back. To be fair, it wasn't a minority too. There was a few of us who had that view. But it was by far, you wouldn't go out on the main quadrangle with a poster saying, what do we want Hex and where do we want it now? You'd end up pretty lonely. So I focused more on the local stuff, the local community. That's what more drove me. I was elected to my local council at a very young age. It's just what I was into. I was into sort of more the again, what drove me into politics was our area missing out. So it struck me that, student politics wasn't going to do anything about that. It was more the local campaigns and the local infrastructure that got me going. And to the degree that I was in, student politics was, not very much at all. It was saying, I was really sort of putting a different point of view to say, Joe Hockey was out there, as you said, sort of campaigning against a lot of those reforms. I was saying, I think they're pretty good because, we do want more people. We're not going to draw up the ladder behind us. We've got to help people get into uni, and that means money. When it comes down to it, it means money. And, we're all going to earn more because we've had this privilege of coming to university, so we should be bloody paying something.
Well, to his defence, so 25 years later, he did say that the age of entitlement was over and that everyone needed to pull up their socks and get in the trenches. But I just want to quickly touch on how you reconcile, as you say, how things weren't as easy as they could be out there in Western Sydney. How would you reconcile candidates like Andrew Charlton, coming into Parramatta and Christina Keneally coming in next door into Fairfield?
No, it's a fair question. Well, look, Andrew grew up in Western Sydney. He's done well. He's worked his guts out. He's moved away, and now he's moving back to give something back. And Christina, likewise. I mean, she's not from Western Sydney, obviously. She's from America, but she's, not from a privileged background. She's worked hard, and she gets the community. She knows our communities well as Premier. I understand the sort of criticism, but I also understand that, what Western Sydney ultimately needs is cabinet ministers fighting for the area and sitting around a cabinet table. Now, the member for Fowler, for example, which is the seat Christina is running for, has never had a cabinet minister. They've never had somebody at the cabinet table. Christina would be at the cabinet table in a Labor government. And I know she'll be saying, well, I live in this community, which she has. She's moved there, credit. You're right to raise her background, but she's living there now. She will be a senior cabinet member. Same, Andrew won't be immediately a cabinet member, but I think we'd all agree he's got huge potential. So, that's really...
Came up with JobKeeper.
Well, yeah. And she did tweet the other day that she was in COVID isolation at home in Liverpool.
Well,
I'm
fair enough that she points that out, though, because there have been stories saying she's promised to move there if she wins. No, she's moved there now. So,
That's another thing I want to ask you about. There's that yarn going around that she's promised to move there. Last election, there was a death tax that was being peddled by Clive Palmer and actually your Liberal opposition, the Morrison government. You can't play dirty because obviously you've got to be very careful. The opposition has to be perfect and the current government can do whatever they like. And we see it, Albanese makes a gaffe on the first day of the campaign and it's the front page for a week. If Morrison had done the same thing, it wouldn't have... We won't put you in a position where you have to say that there's a bias, but we would say that there is, particularly with the Murdoch rags. Now, what I want to ask is, how do you not lose your temper? Because there's a lot of pettiness that you have to deal with. I mean, there's people up there targeting you, putting you on billboards.
How do you know I don't, Clancy? How do you know I don't walk around swearing for 5 minutes before I hold the press conference?
That's the question. How do you not just blow your lid? Because Morrison does. He did the other day without the rates rise. It's not about politics. How do you not blow a fuse and call someone a fucking prick on Sky News when you do roll that gauntlet?
Look, I've been doing this a while now, and I sort of channel my frustration as opposed to my anger, really. I was very frustrated last election about this death tax bullshit, because it was just a complete fantasy, which they just invented. And I thought, I better go out and deal with it. And so I held a press conference saying there will be no death tax. And so what do? They cut an ad of me saying death tax 10 times, and then ran and said, why is Labor talking about a death tax? Yeah, well, because you bastards are talking about a death tax and it's a lie. So, I do find that frustrating, but there's no point, getting angry about it. You just deal with it and you come up with the best response and you come up with the best counter. And that's usually you fight fear with facts. We're dealing with it now, climate. Right, they're out there saying all sorts of things about our climate policy. Our climate policy is, if I say so myself, well-designed, it's sensible, it's well-calibrated, it's pro-economic growth. But they'll just go out and say what they say about it. And they'll also, as I sometimes say to colleagues, well, they're just going to invent our policies anyway, so we should have good ones. If we don't have a good policy, they'll just go out and say what our policy is. They'll just invent it, whether it's a death tax or a carbon tax, or whatever it is. They just invent it. So we're better off having good, solid policies like what we've got in climate, which we can then counter with the facts. And I just channel my frustration into doing that. And, of course, I get up and I read the papers in the morning very early. And, of course, I have, here we go again. This is just ridiculous. But then you think, well, okay, it is what it is. We counter it. We deal with it. And I think, too, also, you just got to remember that people also aren't stupid. I mean, they do factor it in. They do, when you've got an anti-Labor front page every day on the Telegraph, people don't necessarily think, oh, well, that's what I think then, because they read the Telegraph. They know that's the Telegraph view, right? So they factor that in. You can't tell yourself that people are going, oh, I was going to vote Labor, but now
Yeah.
I read this in the Telegraph, so no, I won't. I mean, that's
Well, I mean,
by and large not happening.
Yeah, if it did happen, then Dan Andrews
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
have been assassinated by now, and Anastasia Palaszczuk would have lost by a landslide, as would have McGowan, I guess.
And Alan Jones would still have a job,
Yeah.
I guess. But look, I just want to touch on a few things. I was talking to a few locals up here this morning about it. They were talking about what efforts Australia can do to limit their carbon emissions, because in the scheme of things, they say, we're a population of 25 million. Our democracy is just an appendix on the toxic kind of megacolon that is, the Western world.
Is that what they said this morning on the streets?
Yeah.
Down at the pub.
And they
They were
said,
exact words.
but what impact would 25 million people reducing their carbon emissions have in the scheme of things when you've got billions of people all over
Yeah.
the world who are still trying to live like Americans?
Yeah, look, I hear that argument a lot. I hear it, frankly, not that the people on the streets of Betoota would be coming from this point of view, but I hear that from people who are effectively climate change deniers or delayers, right? That doesn't matter. Let me make a couple of key points. One, we're the 14th biggest emitter in the world. Right? We're the first or second in per capita terms, but the
Yeah.
14th biggest in absolute terms. I.e., so that argument says really, well, sure, somebody should do something about it. The 13 countries that emit more than us should do something about it, but us and the 170 countries that emit the same as us or less than us, we shouldn't have to worry. That's just complete nonsense, right? Complete bullshit. We're all in this, right? And yes, so we can't say just because we're the 14th biggest emitter in the world that somehow what we do doesn't count. Secondly, we are about 1% of emissions, sure. But, we were 1% of troops in World War II as well. We don't say, well, none of that counted. That would be a ridiculous argument. It all counted. What we did, Canada did, everybody did count
Yeah.
it. So,
Even the Kiwis.
especially our Anzac cousins. So, that all counts. And it's just a cop-out to say, well, the rest of the world should do something. Because every country would say that. America would say, well, we're not going to do anything until China does. And China
Yeah.
would say, well, hang on, we're late to this economic growth party, so America should go first. It's just not going to wash. And, we are the largest or the second largest emitter per capita, so we've got a certain moral obligation, I think, and we've got a real obligation. And, final point, not only do we have an obligation, it's good for our economy. We should make the transition because we can be a renewable energy powerhouse. We've been searching for 234 years for a comparative advantage. We have more sunlight hits our landmass than any other country in the world. We're above average wind. Our offshore wind is closer to shore, so it's cheaper than the average around the world. So we've got massive advantages. Why wouldn't we be doing this?
And
Why
we
wouldn't we
have
be taking these opportunities?
The world's third highest reserves of uranium as well.
Yeah, sure. but I'm really focused on making us a renewable energy powerhouse because there are massive opportunities there, and there's countries in our region next door, close by, that can't really do this on their own. Like take Singapore, for example.
Yeah.
One thing that renewable energy does need is space, and they don't have it. They're a city-state. They'll have to buy renewable energy off us, really, if we can produce it and get it to them. Now, we can do that. Like take Suncable, for example, which is a massive solar farm in the Northern Territory, 24 million solar panels. It's going to sell solar energy to Singapore via a submarine cable. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg and what we can do as a country.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we do, Errol, have an obligation, in my view, just because we're 1% of emissions doesn't let us off the hook. But even if we didn't have a moral obligation, this is good for us. Mm-hmm. And this is what I've been trying to achieve in the climate change portfolio, is to break down this 20 years of liberal lies that, action on climate change, but it'll cost you your job. No, it's going to create jobs. Yes, there's change coming. Yes, there's economic change coming, absolutely. You can pretend it's not happening like Matt Canavan and, put your head in the sand and say the world's always going to need our coal and, nothing's going to change. Or you can say, no, the world is changing. 80% of our trading partners are decarbonising. But we can create this new energy. We've got a massive opportunity. And, it's a myth that there's no jobs in renewable energy. There's plenty of jobs in renewable energy. There's plenty of jobs in the regions. The areas that have powered Australia for so long, like the Hunter Valley, Central Queensland, Illawarra, Collie-Bunbury, all of them will power us into the future, but the world is going to change and we can have policies to actually give a framework to get that investment going in renewable energy and create the jobs of the future.
I'd say that there has been a bit of an issue, though, with the Labor Party in the last couple of elections where the word transition out of, the reliance on fossil fuels means that the young kind of men and women on, the outer metro areas who go to work in high-vis and drive a Ford Ranger, they see that as being, the end of their halcyon days of earning, a high income. Can people be transitioned away from these high-paying jobs in this kind of sector into a high-paying job in the renewable energy sector.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, whenever the Labor Party traditionally has said transition, again, the Christensens and Canavans and Joyces have come out and said, they are going to transition you out of a job. You know, that's basically their words.
You'll be living in the mangroves and
So I talk about the transformation of the economy and all the jobs that are going to be created. You know, it's more than a transition. Transition sounds like something you have to do because, you know, you're sort of forced to it. We can transform the economy. Renewable energy jobs can be created with the right policies, and they can be well-paying and more. I mean, we can manufacture more in Australia. You know, we've put 60 million solar panels on roofs in Australia in the last 10 years. How many have been made in Australia? 1%.
Couldn't tell you.
1%.
Yeah, 1%.
1%. You know, 99% made in, you know, mainly China.
Yeah.
Right. But the solar panel is mainly an Australian invention, the modern solar panel, University of New South Wales. So we've exported the technology and we've exported the jobs. So with the right policy settings, we're going to put a lot more than 60 million solar panels in the next 10 years as we move, you know, really to a much more renewable economy. We should be making them here. We should be making batteries here. We're the world's largest source of lithium. We should be adding the value. Again, these are all opportunities we'll miss out on if we just keep pretending it's not happening and, you know, arguing about whether we're really committed to net zero or not, which is what the government of the day is doing. They're wasting time. Get on with it. And we want to get on with it.
Well, this is a kind of almost a greater question about decentralisation. But, you know, as Errol just pointed out there, the word transition is terrifying to both carbon-exposed workers and, of course, the coalition government. Say, you know, Labor Party wins this election, you're running the ball on this portfolio, you pull into a town like Mackay, 40 to 60,000 people, I'm going to say up to 10,000 people, their livelihood relies on the fossil fuel sector. What can you do for those people? You know, if you had the power and everyone was working with you and you had a majority government, what are you going to say to those people? Because they do have a lifestyle, they have a life that they don't want to lose. Would you say they're FIFOs anyway? Would you send them to the lithium mines instead? What's the plan there, and what is the plan for the regions?
So, Clancy, I do that already as a shadow minister. You know, I go into regional towns. It's part of my job to talk to people in the cities, but it's a big part of my job to talk to people in the regions. And I'd keep doing it as minister if we win. You know, I go to coal-fired power stations and I go to gas-fired power stations, and, you know, we have the high-vis meetings. And as I say to them, I've got to win the argument with you, because if I can convince you, you're the ones with your jobs actually on the line. And I talk to them about the changes, and I talk to them about how the world's moving away from coal, and I talk to them about how there'll be no new coal-fired power stations in coal-fired power stations, you know. And you know what? Those conversations, sure, they can be a little bit, you know, pointed at times, but they're good conversations. And I have not had one worker ever say to me, ever, we want a new coal-fired power station. Because these guys aren't stupid, right? They see the world moving. They know what's happening, and they worry about the future, sure. But they know that when this coal-fired power station closes, nobody's going to build a new one. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So what's going to replace it? Well, that's the conversation you can have with them about green hydrogen and electrolyzers and how many jobs are involved and the benefits of hydrogen and the benefits of storage and what that means and the opportunities for export and creating jobs. And, you know, I sometimes use the example, you know, you might think of this town as a coal town. It's like Kodak thinking of themselves as a film company when actually they're an image company, right? If they'd seen the world changing and thought, well, we help people save their memories, it happens to be through film, but we're going to transition to a new technology, Kodak might still be around today. Same with a community. You say, well, you're not actually a coal or gas town, you're an energy town.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can make energy and you can store energy and there's lots of jobs in it. And as I said, you know, those conversations go pretty well. The workers have views about how it should happen, and, you know, they have views about retraining. And a lot of people in the city say, man, why don't we just retrain the workers? And I say, it's not that simple, because while retraining is important, when I go to the workers, they say, yeah, retraining has got to have a job at the end. You know, no point retraining is having all these courses to make us bulldozer drivers if there's no bulldozer drivers at the end of it. You've got to have a plan and you've got to have an end point. And we do. You know, that's why our policies, which we put out in December, we had them modelled independently. It shows 604,000 jobs created from the policy settings, 5 out of 6 of them in the regions. So that's what I can talk about when I go to those regions and say, you know, if we get this policy right and the settings right and the certainty and we get the investment going, the jobs are going to be created here, not in the cities. Because apart from solar panels on our roofs, we can't make energy in the cities. We don't have it's not what we do. We don't have the space, we don't have the skills, we don't have the access to the grid. That all happens in the Hunter Valley, in Queensland, etc. So, you know, as I said, those conversations in the regions go pretty well, and they live and breathe the energy economy. They see it. They know more about it than, you know, most of us in the cities, and they know when they're being sold nonsense as the National Party sells them, and I think they're up for a very constructive conversation.
Well, speaking of the National Party, there are a lot of people who listen to this show on the tractors, all up and down the eastern
Did you see that
seaboard.
British MP the other day? He was caught in the House of Commons chamber looking at pornography, and he said, I was searching for tractors, but I got somehow it took me to a porn site.
Yeah.
So,
Hit the pop-up, the old pop-up link.
So especially in this country, the farmers are essentially a protected species to the point where they need to be brought to the table whenever we start talking about climate change, because farmers are the biggest emitters of carbon in our economy, through livestock and whatnot. How is Labor engaging the agriculture kind of sector on where they're moving forward with your climate policy?
yeah, again, I think there's been a shift change here. I think there's, again, a bit of a myth in some media that somehow rural people or farmers aren't on board for climate change action. That's not my experience, because farmers love the country they farm and they see it changing in front of their eyes. Of course, I don't want to generalise, because, of course, there are some who have different views, but all the evidence shows farm profits are down, farm productivity is down, as a total, because of climate change, because the country is changing and not in a good way. So there's lots of groups out there like Farmers for Climate Action, and there's others who I've engaged with, and again, they want to be part of it, and they see the opportunities again. See the opportunities of carbon farming, they see the opportunities from better soil management, they see the opportunities of the famous Asparagopsis seaweed, which stops methane from cows. Sure, it's complicated. Sure, there's challenges, but
Cat is a big supporter of that one, actually. The
is
old,
he? Yeah,
the old
algae.
algae.
Bob loves his algae. But Asparagopsis, again, it sounds very nerdy, but that's Australian scientists who've worked out that this particular type of seaweed, if you put a little bit in feed, can reduce a cow's methane emissions by up to 80% or more. Now, again, we're a broadacre farming country. I'm not pretending it's all simple or easy, but if you don't engage with the farming community, you're not going to make any progress, and the farming community does want to be engaged, and the National Party, I think, has got it wrong. Or they've got it right, because maybe Matt Canavan has actually been honest about one thing, because he did say in a podcast, not this one, but another one a couple of months ago, we don't represent farmers. We represent...
he likes to represent people like his brother, I guess,
yeah. He's got a different view of what the country party used to be.
Yeah, and he's from the Gold Coast, and he's Italian. Now, I want to talk to you about the Labor Party in the bush. So, as anyone would know with family in the bush, we've been voting Nat in the Maranoa since about the 40s, but a lot of the regions, there was a Labor MP between the Catters up there, between Bob and his father.
Yep.
There was a Labor MP, and a lot of the regions, particularly in the days of shearing, before the wide comb dispute, there was Labor always had a presence in the bush, and in fact that was the heartland in many kind of regional electorates. You're talking to us about the regions and everyone you're talking to being open-minded and willing to come to the table with some of the ideas.
Not everyone, but a lot, yeah.
So coming to the table with some of the ideas you're bringing out there. What's going on in Labor HQ where they're not saying, let's get out there, let's spend a year campaigning out there? How have you lost some of these regions? Like, what is stopping you from going out there and having another dig? I mean, in a crazy, crazy universe in this election where we end up with some sort of hung scenario and the Teals or whatever, I mean, what's stopping a Labor national coalition?
Well, you're right. Historically, there have been Labor country party coalitions, at the state level, including not that long ago in South Australia, there was a National Party minister in Mike Rand's government. I don't think that's going to happen nationally. I think there's just too much of a gap between the National Party and the Labor Party, because the National Party sort of sometimes call themselves socialists, but they have a very different view of,
Surely there's a spot for Darren Chester, I mean.
Darren Chester's a good bloke. Yeah, he doesn't really fit into the modern National Party, I suspect. But in terms of the Labor Party, you're right. I love Labor Party history, and there's a lot of rural history to the Labor Party. I mean, some of our greatest leaders have been from the bush. I mean, Andrew Fisher, our second Prime Minister, was the member for Wide Bay in Queensland. And if you look even in New South Wales at the history, the McKell government, William McKell became Labor Premier of New South Wales in the 40s, and he started that very long period of Labor government, which went into the 60s. His whole strategy was a country strategy. He wanted Labor members in the bush, and it worked. Most of the seats in the bush in New South Wales were Labor. Now, it's hard work. We've got a lot of work to do, but we do it. Albo and I were travelling through farms and rural New South Wales earlier this year when lockdown finished. We've got senators who are working their guts out. Senator Deb O'Neill, for example, in New South Wales, is always visiting country seats. I do it when I can because I think it's important. I do think in my particular portfolio, as we've discussed, it's huge opportunities. Does that mean we're going to, all of a sudden win country seats? No, but I mean, I wouldn't write us off in the medium to longer term as becoming more competitive in the regions, and I would certainly want to.
Yeah, so you just kind of be coming back to your Ben Chifley roots.
Yeah.
I suppose you could call the areas, of Orange and Bathurst part of the country, but I think that Sydney's creeping further and further and further.
Well, it certainly was when he was the member there and living there, right? Yeah.
I want to talk to you about this dark horse that's coming through in the shape of independence. Not really a concern for the Labor Party because they're targeting moderate Liberal seats. Could become a real concern in the next few weeks for Morrison. One thing that the Liberal Party does is they're basically in chaos, outside of an election. Particularly, the New South Wales Liberals had a big problem with Morrison. We all saw that, and there's pre-selection dramas and all that, yada yada yada. But they tighten up for an election, and they run pretty well. What do you think is wrong with the current government that is making them lose their blue ribbon seats? I mean, we can talk about climate change.
Sure.
Easily, that's a big element of this. It's a big concern in the inner cities. It's a big concern on the over-insured houses of northern beaches, Sydney, with the eroding sand and the swimming pools going into the Pacific Ocean.
They'll almost be uninsurable soon, I'll tell you what.
But what else is it? Do you think it's a personality thing? Do you think there is just an ick? I put that down to quite often the female voters are aware of an ick. And they have a sixth sense about a person or a machine.
I think there's a bit of that, but particularly with some of the terrible things that have happened in Parliament and Parliament House over the last few years. But I think there's also a broader problem for the government and for the Liberal Party. And it is about climate change, but let me put it in broader terms. For years, the Liberal Party has gotten away with being basically all things to all people, So they ran around at the last election in 2019 saying, in the regions, climate action is going to cost you your job, climate action is going to cost you your job. And frankly, city voters didn't hold them to account for that. They could get away with it. So they could win Kooyong and they could win Capricornia with very different messages. I think city voters have caught up with them. So we're not putting up with this anymore. You are not going to delay climate action and you are not going to run around getting seats in the bush and think we're okay with it by your lies, Take those seats that are under challenge, whether it be Kooyong, Wentworth or North Sydney or Goldstein or Mackellar or Curtin. They're not sort of radical communities, right? They're quite, frankly, well off and historically, economically conservative, but they're also want to see action on some of the biggest issues facing our country, including climate change, and they're just sick of it. They're just sick of the inaction, and they're sick of this nonsense argument that they run in seats in regional Australia to try and get people's votes, and they know it's not true, and they're now holding them to account. I don't know exactly how those seats will fall, but I know the Liberals are now being held to account because the Liberals just sort of took these communities for granted and say, they'll keep voting for us. Kooyong and Wentworth, we can get away with delaying climate action. We can get away with lying about the economic impacts in the bush because these voters won't hold us to account because these seats have always been Liberal. Well, that's not the case anymore. So obviously I want people in those seats to vote Labor, but stretch for most of them, just too far. But they're having a serious look at the independents in many of those seats. Some of them are we've got good Labor candidates in many of the seats as well. But I do recognise it's a genuine contest, and we'll see what happens. It is very interesting, but I do think that's what it comes down to. It's just those voters saying we're as mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore.
I just want to quickly talk about this Help to Buy scheme that's helping, that will help a lot of Australians into their first home. A few criticisms around that. It's kind of limited to 10,000 at the moment, which, in the scheme of things is really a fart in the wind, really. Is there any plan to expand this any further? I mean, I know that the incumbent government now, they have, a first home scheme that really is more about optics and whatnot. I think a lot of voters were really hoping that Labor's answer to that would have had a bit more substance. But at the same time, a lot of voters know that the country's broke at the moment and we can't go around spending all this money on stupid things like other people's houses.
I think, Errol, that 10,000 is a decent number. You're right, it's a small proportion of the broad population. But we're talking about it as a proportion of, frankly, mainly young people trying to get into the market. So it's a bigger proportion of first home buyers, right? So it does make a difference. Of course, we'll see how it goes, and, if it's working very well, as I expect it will be, then obviously, we'd like to do more if and when we can, but, one step at a time. It's a huge issue, and, we're the only party, of government, i.e. a party that might form government, going to the election with a housing affordability plan. I mean, what's the government's plan? Absolutely nothing. I don't mean to just, deflect straight to them, but our plan is good, and I see the Liberal Party's now sort of reduced to, there's going to be an independent assessment of the renovations, and they might not be able to leave it to the kids. I mean, they're down really sort of. I know when you're sort of attacking that level of detail, it means you really think it's probably a good idea, but you've got to find something to complain about it. So, look, I think it's a good policy. It's been working at the state level. Again, you can say only 10,000, sure, but it sits also alongside the existing state schemes which impact on people, help people, like Western Australia and South Australia have got schemes which are very, very similar to this. So you put them together, and if you're a young person trying to get the market, you'll have a choice. I could go to the West Australian Key Start, or I could go to the federal scheme, etc. You've got options. So it's giving people more options. Yeah. And does it solve all the problems overnight? Sure. I actually think it's the first time the Commonwealth's sort of gone down this road, or an opposition has flagged this at the federal level, first time, that this has been done. So I think it's a pretty good start.
Well, a lot of these kind of schemes and policies are aimed at, stimulating industries that are predominantly, staffed by men. What's Labor going to do for women? A big issue for women is running the time and the leave entitlements to start a family, and then there's re-entering the workforce after to that. And really the only way that a lot of women can re-enter the workforce is through childcare.
Well, I guess I'd point to three things, Errol. One, on the weekend we announced that this might sound like pretty basic, but it's actually pretty important. On the weekend we announced that we'd have gender pay equity as an objective of the Fair Work Act. Like, it actually should be something we're trying to do. We technically made differential wages illegal in Australia in, I think, 1969. We still have a massive gender pay gap for all sorts of reasons, and our government should at least be trying to fix that. And we want to make a contribution to that by getting the Fair Work Act moving in that direction. Secondly, again, this won't apply to everyone, and it's not exclusively, to be clear, a female issue, but we should have domestic violence leave in Australia. You should be able to take time to deal with the most difficult circumstances you're probably going to face in your life and not be worried about losing your job. So we would deal with that. And then finally, as you said, childcare. We have a pretty big childcare offering, which just makes it easier for so many families, including young families with primarily mums getting back into the workforce. And again, the government just sort of says, it's nothing to see here. Well, we've got a pretty big, that's actually a pretty big difference, pretty big offering there. So I guess I'd point to those three things as pretty substantial policy offerings for exactly the sort of issues that you're talking about.
Yeah, I just want to quickly unpack that childcare offering, in that a lot of women who find themselves going back to work, they're honestly only going back just to pay childcare. So I think one of the biggest issues is the affordability of childcare. How does this scheme tackle that?
Basically, it provides more support to exactly. You're right. Families going, should I go back to work? Well, actually, I'll only just be making enough to pay for childcare. So maybe I should go back to work for other reasons, but it's not for financial reasons. And that's a pretty tough decision for families to make. So it basically provides a lot more support to families, right up and down wherever they are in the system, and provides less of a, if you like, an effective. You call that the effective tax rate, right? You're effectively taxing some women, primarily women, going back to the workforce at like 110%. So our policy actually sort of explicitly tackles that, explicitly deals with it, and says, well, actually, this is wrong. There's all sorts of reasons why we want women back in the workforce, partly for them, partly for the economy. It's good. The economy needs them back, so let's get rid of this ridiculous effective tax rate. And that's basically what the policy does.
I want to thank you for answering our questions, honestly. I also want to thank you for leaving yourself so exposed. You're lucky in the sense that it's on the Betoota Advocate podcast, because any newspaper that would want to take you out of context would get laughed out of the room for referencing the Betoota Advocate as a source.
I don't know. It's I find it one of Australia's more credible newspapers.
Well, thank you for that. But, there'll be no favours to you heading into this election.
No, we have been courted by both sides in the past, and I'll tell you what, we know who butters our bread.
Bob Catter.
Now,
fair enough. Who could argue with Bob?
I do want to ask you the fun questions now. Where do you think you're going to get up? What's your path to victory? We spoke to Albo about 6 months ago, and he said he had high hopes for the very tip, Leichhardt. I'm not sure if that's still a similar feeling, but where are you guys looking at forging this path to victory?
Well, look, Clancy, I actually genuinely think this is going to be really close. We meant to say it's really close. I actually really think it's going to be close. I think, despite the fact that Morrison is, as popular as the proverbial and the proverbial, it's going to be tight, and it's not easy for us to form government ever from opposition. So I think it's going to be tight. Yes, the seat of Leichhardt is one we're very interested in. In Sydney, I'd be looking closely at the seat of Reid. Sally Situ, our excellent candidate there. I've got high hopes for her. I'd be looking at the seat of Robertson, Dr. Gordon Reed's our candidate there. We've got hopes there. Jerome Lexale in Bennelong. Bennelong's seat we've only won once, famously.
Yeah. Well, in the same kind of fashion that we saw 11 years ago, really, which is when when Howard lost it after the race.
Yeah, that's right.
Were increased in the middle of an election campaign.
So that's just a few. That's not exclusive list, but there are a few seats I'd be looking at down in Sydney, a long way from the Diamantina, but that's where I'd be looking in Sydney. There's a few. Obviously those Tasmanian seats are always tight.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about
Andrew Wilkie's on a knife, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, we'd like a Labor member there.
He's the only teal candidate running against Labor, isn't he?
Yeah, that is traditional Labor seat, which he's held for now quite a few years. Yeah, but look, those Bass and Braddon are seats that we are really trying to win.
Yeah.
They're always hard to call and always very, very close. Bass in particular, we talk about insecure work. The member for Bass traditionally has a pretty insecure job, and we'll be trying pretty hard to get Ross Hart elected there in Bass.
Now, I also appreciate you not being too confident, not being too cocky. Looking back at that last election, there was a lot of different things we point to. I guess I would point to the regions being misunderstood. Things were good before the bushfires and the pandemic, and there were a lot of things that people didn't want to change in their lives. Is there an element of playing it safe? I mean, negative gearing was a relatively radical policy in the scheme of things when you talk to anyone who had the free education and got into the housing market in the 1980s with a house that cost $25,000 and is a genius for having that foresight. What would you say about the current approach? Are you playing it safe, or do you think you're taking some risks with your policy?
Yeah, I think, look, the last election is a bit like a game of Jenga, when you never know quite which thing you pulled out has caused the tower to fall. And we'll all have views, and you never really know. There'll be any number of factors. There were lots of things. In hindsight, you look back and think, yeah, we probably could have done that better, right? And it's not just any one particular thing. But to your question, I would put it this way, that we're more focused this time. I don't think it's actually less ambitious, but at the last election we had lots of things going on, and we did open ourselves up to the whole scare campaign thing, because any one particular policy you could defend, right? But then when you actually had it as part of the whole sort of picture, we were defending too many flanks, and it became just ultimately too hard. And then we were dealing with the whole culture wars in the regions, etc., as you said, which, again, in hindsight, there's things we could have and should have done differently, and all of us. But I think we've really sort of taken the approach now of, okay, let's really focus in, I would argue, a climate change policy which is ambitious, 43%. We've got 92 months to achieve it. That's not long. That's actually a big task. And, we knew doing that we'd be opening ourselves up to this silly scare campaign. That's fine. We'll just deal with it. But we are trying to sort of pick the fights pretty carefully. So we've got a pretty focused agenda, so we can concentrate on those things where we can really make the case for a mandate.
Thank you for joining us, Chris Bowen. All the best. And what's your team out there? Bulldogs?
Parramatta and the mighty Western Sydney Giants. I know you're not particularly AFL people, but, Western Sydney Giants.
I would say as a parliamentary member from Western Sydney, it would be safe to have an AFL team.
Yes.
And thank God that the AFL has made it easy for you.
Yeah, well, that's right, because we've got one team for Western Sydney. And, of course, there's Western Sydney Wanderers in the round code.
Well, I hope that your political party does better than all three of those teams in the next few weeks.
But it's a low bar.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks, mate. Good to see you guys.